Well, I'm going to try to give you a little bit bigger picture of the swine industry and talk to you really about what I think is some good years coming forward for us here as we have made really big adjustments to what you know has been the biggest shock for our industry from an economic standpoint, and that is the tremendous changes in feed cost that we have seen. And you know, sometimes, at least when I'm teaching classes, I get to my conclusion right up front, because that first minute's the only time they're awake in my class. No, that's not true. I go shake them up a little bit. But I know that's not true for you. But one of the conclusions we're going to say is that, you know, you can go back 5 years ago and our industry was based on a $2 corn in the Midwest or $2.50 corn in the Midwest. We couldn't even imagine what would happen to us with $4 corn, let alone $6 and at the highs $8 corn. That's no longer the case. Our industry, the swine industry, has adjusted now to where we actually can outbid today ethanol plants. So we see ethanol plants shutting down right now because we in the swine industry can bid on up around $7 for corn, and they're back, at least the Midwestern plants that we're looking at are more like about $5.70, $5.80 is what they can bid for ethanol, for corn to go into ethanol plants. So that tells us something really has changed. We're in a competitive position at this point. We are going to talk about the consumer, how much consumer consumption on pork we have lost in order to get these retail prices high enough so we could get hog prices high enough so that we could afford this price on corn. We're going to get some of that consumption back, but we've got another tremendous opportunity going on right now, and that is the buyers of pork and consumers of pork outside the United States. Tremendous growth opportunity, and our industry is globalized and is meeting those challenges and having those opportunities. So let's get into a few pictures and try to give you some understanding of how economics work and how we are looking at a future here where we think those factors that have been driving feed prices higher and higher and higher over these last 5 years, that we're actually going to start to see some factors that will cause those prices to moderate some. Now, there's a lot of uncertainties. Nobody knows how this world's going to evolve, but we're going to show you some data and some kind of trend lines that we think we're going to be in a period coming up here where we may see some moderations in feed prices, and that will be very beneficial for our industry. Okay, so as I talk to really everybody in the animal industry and certainly in the pork production industry, hey, if we're still around, if we've made it through these adjustments the last 5 years, we have now got our industry adjusted where we can pay $6 or $7 a bushel for corn. If we have made it this far, we're still standing. We've made it. We have made it through one of the biggest shocks. You made it. We've made it through one of the biggest shocks that our industry has faced in quite some time. And as you think about a shock, we think about it in economics, and we think about a shock. Something major changes in an industry. And as that change occurs, how does that track and influence what goes on in our industries over a period of time? Or you think about somebody taking a big rock and throwing it in the pond. And there's that big immediate reaction, that shock, and then there is the adjustment that comes over a period of time. So what we're going to say is that this big shock of feed grains and soybean protein and other feed ingredients going up, we have adjusted our industry. So now, as we've said, we can pay that $6 to $7. So first we've got to look at what are the drivers. Why were feed grain prices and protein prices and forage prices going up so dramatically? So the bold line there is corn use going to ethanol. Everybody knows that story in the United States. But when you look at how that expansion from the 2005 crop to the 2010 crop was growing And you can see the slope of that line, not just 45 degrees, but well above a 45-degree rate of increase. That's government policy driven primarily, back with our Energy Act coming through Congress and signed by the President to get alternative fuels, and of course, in the first case here, corn ethanol, very, very rapidly into our fuel mix. Now, you also see the very last dot on that intense line is the 2011 crop. And what you see there, instead of going up sharply, that rate of expansion now levels off. For the 2011 to 2014 crops, we're going to see the rate of growth of ethanol not flat, but it's going to be at a much lower level. Well, how do I know that? Well, that is the design from Congress of the amount of corn ethanol, traditional corn ethanol, that's to be blended into our gasolines. So we are really at a point of leveling off that big demand growth. Now, what causes corn prices to go up, or what causes any price to go up? As I tell my students, I teach commodity marketing. And if you don't know the answer to a question on exam, try supply and demand. You'll probably get half credit for that, you know. Probably that's worth a whole lot. You know, that's sort of where a lot of commodity economists come out. What causes prices to go up? Demand is increasing faster than supply. Okay, when demand, so your utilization is going up faster than the producers can keep up with that production, and what happens is you draw down inventory. You can sometimes do that for 1 year or 2 years because there's some extra inventory. But if you're using up more year after year after year than you're producing, you're going to draw down your inventories. Now, when you're talking about basic inventories or inventories of basic foods that go into our food supply, like corn, like soybean meal, and these other feed ingredients, what happens when the world essentially is thinking about opening the cupboards to see how much is in the cupboards, how much reserve is there, and they open those doors, basic food, and it's empty. There is nothing there. And what that says is the world has to produce this year the food that the world is going to eat this year. There's no reserve. There's no extra inventory. So this process we have gone through over these 5 years on corn as an example is here's the big demand growth factor. Demand year after year was growing faster than supply, and we're pulling our inventories down further and further and further, our ending inventories at the end of the year. There's just no reserve to meet any kind of a short crop situation. Okay, so you can begin to anticipate that you're going to have really high prices in an environment where consumption is outpacing supply. One of the reasons for that is this. Last 2 years in the United States, we've had a very short corn crop and a very, very short corn crop last year. So we've got to think about how important was that weather. If we return to normal yields, you know, this is really going to change the scenario very rapidly here in the United States, combined with this demand growth slowing down substantially. So we're going to be in a time period from the 2011 crop, which was last fall, that we'll be marketing through this coming August, through the 2014 crop, where actually supply is going to be able to grow, we believe, faster than the usage each year. And what that means is we're going to start to rebuild inventories so that when the world goes and opens the door, they say, well, there's some inventory, and we could take a weather shock around the world someplace and not have to put these prices up so dramatically. Okay, so the big growth there, 2005 crop to the 2010 crop, and we call that going vertical. That is going vertical. And when you see things in economics and business, if it's your sales or your dollars of revenue, you like for them to go vertical. Now again, the point is we have hit the point where that is really going to slow down. In fact, the number of acres, we get about a 2 bushel trend yield on corn a year. That'll give us about 170, 180 million more bushels each year, just trend yields, 2 bushels a year. The rate of growth for corn ethanol will be a little over 100 million bushels. So it's going to take less land each year in the next 12, 13, and 14 crop years, less land to meet the ethanol demand. What's really short is land. So we see all of these crops in short supply, we have a shortage of land. And what we're saying is this is going to change. It's going to take less land to produce that ethanol. And after 2015, the renewable fuel standard is flatlined at 15 billion gallons. And if we can get, so it does not go up at all. It is totally flatlined. And if you can get those, continue to get those 2 bushels a year, that takes less and less land to supply the corn for ethanol. And then here is the second one that has been going on that's really overlooked, or you don't hear it near as much. These are the bushels of soybeans we export to China, from the United States to China. And if you can look back, see roughly around 2005 crop, that was the 357, but 350 to 400 million bushels of beans we were exporting to China. And that expanded to 900, a little over 900 million by 2010. Now, how much is that? You know, we have trouble, well, yeah, that's a number. Okay, what does that mean? By the time we were the 2010 crop, farmers, if they went out to their soybean bin and they got 3 soybeans and they looked at those beans and they say, well, our biggest customer ought to get the biggest and plumpest and nicest bean. I'll choose that bean. That 1 out of 3 beans produced in the United States headed to China, with most of that growth occurring in the 5 crop years from 2005 to 2010. Now, what did we just say about the big growth in corn ethanol? It came what years? 2005 to 2010. So these two got laid on top of each other. Again, we never, and by law, we understood some of the consequences of the federal ethanol policy. We didn't know the Chinese demand was going to come at the same time. So those two, when we try to weigh out which one was most important, they come out, they're about the same size. We measure them in how many additional acres of land did it take to meet those two demands in 5 short years. We're just talking about the U.S. That's 30 million additional acres of land that it took to meet those 2 new demands in just 5 years. Now, another thing about economics we know is that, okay, these grain prices went up a lot. So this should be causing some things to go on the demand side of grains. That is, end users are adjusting. End users will use less of those when the prices go up. End users like the animal industry. We're going to show you how that occurred in a little bit. But there's also what we economists call supply response. High prices, high returns to land, get producers interested in finding ways to increase production or find new land to put in production. If we ask that question around the United States, in your home areas, have there been a lot more land brought into production? The answer is no. But is that the case for the world? No. If you look around the world, there has been this totals 105 million new acres come into production. This is actually harvested acreage. So it's another thing that is not highly recognized, that we've not just been 1 or 2 or 3 years into these high feed prices. We've been multiple years. And when you give the world and the world's producers time to get more production in place, they are doing it. Where is that? And again, those countries or those continents are here that you can see. Start over on the left-hand side. As many of you would guess, South America. 30 million new acres in crop production in South America since 2005, since we really started to take off. Now again, the 2005 crop in the United States was a $2 corn crop, so it was really into the sixth crop, but we're trying to get back to the last of the cheap corn, and since that time, 30 million new acres have come into production in South America. There's 15 million of those acres are in Argentina. That's largely the pampas, the cattle grazing area, where they're converting that over into crop production. Brazil is 10 million of that, and then the rest of South America is 5 million acres. Okay, so that we'd all guess. They have land, they have had pasture land, they can bring that into production. They're very well geared for corn and soybean production in Argentina, and certainly soybean production in Brazil. The second one there is the former Soviet Union. And that's about 19 million acres have come into production in the former Soviet Union. And you say, wait a minute, that's largely the collective farms that they had under the old Soviet system, Eastern European and Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, etc. And you say that was 20 years ago the former Soviet Union broke up, right? Well, that's right, but there was not a lot of financial incentive to get that land back into production back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And you stop and think about that and you say, what do you mean there wasn't incentive? Corn in the United States of America from the 1998 crop through the 05 crop averaged $2 a bushel. Prices were very low. The United States and Europe were producing grains and selling them in the world market below cost. Farmers in the U.S. couldn't raise corn for $2 a bushel. The federal government was subsidizing 50 to 70 cents a bushel. So there wasn't, if you were a producer in another country, there wasn't a lot of incentive to try to get land organized. Has there been the last few years? You better believe there's a lot of incentive to get land organized, to get those collective farms really tuned up. Let's see, let's go on along there. South Asia is primarily India. So India with huge population, growing incomes, a real need for food production. So they're on top of this. East Asia, the biggest country there is China. And so in China, all the land is owned by the communist government. So they can do a lot of things in land reform to try to get bigger production units, get more technology to that land. Now they do have a lot of peasant farmers on that land. So this is a social issue of how quickly they move some of those rural communities into more modern agriculture. And then we go to Africa. And this one kind of knocks your socks off, 17 million acres in Africa. And you say, what in the world's going on in Africa? But you stop and think about that. In Africa, as a continent, there is probably more undeveloped farmland in Africa than there is on any other continent. Undeveloped land. What that means is there's lots of land where there's opportunity to get that into agricultural production. Now, Africa, while there's huge financial opportunity now, there's also a lot of hardship. It's not easy in Africa. And just a quick illustration of that would be a country like Somalia. Now, Somalia is that country where those who run that country are those pirates with machine guns who go out and board ships and hold them for ransom. The government is not strong. There's not law and order in Somalia. So you can imagine you and I get an investment group together and we get a contract with kind of the weak government in Somalia that we get the opportunity to develop 20,000 acres of land for agricultural production. Okay, so in Somalia, we've got our contract all signed and dated and all that. We got this piece of paper. We take one step into Somalia. Who do we meet? The first thing, a pirate with a machine gun. And of course, through our interpreter, what do? We explain, we have a contract. See, on this sheet of paper, a contract. We have legally binding contract. Then what does the pirate say back to us? You have a contract. I have a machine gun. We say, we'll step back here and tear up the contract. So it's hard. It's hard. But right next door in Ethiopia, government is stronger. There is some law and order. Saudi Arabia, making large investments in Ethiopia. The government is essentially moving those peasant farmers off of their traditional lands, helping them find some land someplace else. Saudis are developing water projects so they can develop reservoirs for irrigation and then to get land into production for the export of wheat and cotton. Export into the world market of wheat and cotton. We've got Wall Street money, we've got big investment money in the U.S. and around Europe headed to Africa, and some of the biggest investments are out of China. Chinese investments going into Africa to try to find those areas where they can get development started. Now, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, but you look at that side of it versus what's the other side. What is the financial opportunity if you can do this? So this is where we got to say economic incentives cause supply to respond. Now that 105 million acres around the world, that 105 million acres is about 40% of the cropland in the United States. The United States is the biggest supplier of food products to the world by far. And we have added, not in the U.S., but around the world, 40% of the equivalent of the United States crop base. And we're not saying it's as high of yielding as the U.S., but it makes you start to say things are changing, and we can see these changes. You had big demand surges, but now we're starting to get big supply surges. We go over here to the United States. It actually says North America, no change. We think we're going to get some change. We think it's likely we're going to release more of the conservation reserve land. We have a little under 30 million acres still in the CRP. We'll release some of that. We're going to provide some additional opportunity in the United States through our policy. And that makes a lot of sense. We're not in a period of surplus. We're in a period of shortage. If you're in a period of shortage, the last thing you want to do is pay landowners to keep land out of production. So I think we are seeing some changes in Washington. At least these views are beginning to get through there. Okay, let's move along and see how this has affected us in the animal industry. And as we think about the animal industry, this is per capita consumption here in the United States of our 4 major meats. And of course, we all put pork number 1, but then we'd have to throw a little beef in there. And I guess we'd have to admit there's some chicken consumed and some turkey. So you put those 4 together. And by 2007, the last influence of our $2 corn, 222 pounds per capita of consumption per person. What do you reckon happens when corn goes to $6 and $7 and $8? Well, there's what happens. So now this year, 2012, per capita consumption in the United States will be at estimated at 198 pounds. Since 2007 through 2012, this 5 years, 24 pound per person less consumption of animal protein if you take those 4 meats. So you think about that, wow, this is a big impact, and this has largely been caused from the high feed prices as our industries adjusted to those high feed prices. So how did our industries adjust? Go back to a little bit of economics. Okay, you think about that. Some of your swine clients, what did they do when corn went from $2 basically a bushel up to $6 a bushel, tripled in price? Well, here's what they did. They looked on their records, oh my gosh, my cost of production has gone up a lot. So I went to my packer and I told my packer, Mr. or Mrs. Packer, my costs are a lot higher. You need to pay me a lot more for my hogs. And the packer said, that's right, I'll be glad to do that. It doesn't work like that. If you're not familiar with the way markets work, just because a farmer's cost goes up, that doesn't mean the packer pays any more. So what happened, this is the tragic financial time we went through in hog production in 2008, 2009, and early 2010. that producer can't pass on those higher costs. They have to absorb the higher cost in losses. Now, some people call losses, financial losses, you know what a thrill is? A thrill in life. Some people call losses an inverse thrill. You'll have to think about that one a little bit, you know. Say, how was that convention when you go home and tell your spouse? How was that convention in Denver? I hope you all say it's a thrill. But some of you might say, well, that was an inverse thrill. Well, what do you mean by that? Okay. So losing money is not fun. And finally, what happens after enough losses? It takes a period of discouragement, and finally that discouragement results in people cutting back on production, some getting out, and as we know, some going bankrupt. And what happens when you get through that process of a couple years? You shift the supply curve back to the left. That's what we're illustrating there. And that pushes prices up. So that's what's happened. It's not that we've lost our consumers. It's that as you finally got the number of hogs down, you got the production of hogs down, that allowed the live prices to go up. And now consumers are paying record high prices for pork. And they're just not going to eat as much of it. But the good news is they're paying enough that our hog producer clients can pay $6 or $7 for corn. That's the economics. And this is reflected then in this visual down there on the bottom is the per capita supply of pork. And we've got some years like 5, 4, 7, 6 in there, producing about 50, 51 pounds of pork, selling live hogs about $45, $50. Now you can see the pattern going back to the left for 2010 as we finally started liquidating hogs, getting our supplies a lot smaller. And then 11 last year and 12, we're now out there supplying about 45 to 46 pounds, not 50 pounds. So we're now record high prices, and we as an industry, we can pay the $6 and $7. It took a lot of trauma to get here. Consumers are paying a big price for this. But our industry has now adjusted. We can pay $6 to $7 as long as we can get those live hog values up there in the 60s. Okay, so let's look at what this has meant to the multiple livestock species. This is the per capita consumption on the left, per capita consumption of those 4 species. The green line is beef. And this is an opportunity for us in pork, but let me tell you about the beef story first. The beef industry has just got decimated from 2 things, the high feed prices first, and then the Southern Plains drought that you all know about. It's continued to cause the liquidation of cows. Their per capita supplies of beef from 2006-07, that was the last of the $2 corn, 2006, 2007, and these are indexes. That is down to 87 now, 17% drop in per capita supplies of beef here in the United States. There just isn't much beef available. If you want beef, you're going to pay record high prices for it here in the United States. The pork is the purplish line there, and we're down about 7% on per capita supplies in the United States. Now you'd say, well, we're losing consumers. Well, the bottom line is, if you're going to pass those high feed costs along, you got to do that. The consumer's got to pay for this. This is a cost to the consumer. Okay, now, and then the purplish line over on the right-hand side is saying that prices of our live animals or the farm level value then go up. You drop your supplies, prices are now on hogs 40% higher than they were back in 6-7, the last of the $2 corn. We have now passed on our $6 to $7 corn cost. On the other hand, this looks very the same, but the right-hand visual is total production. While we have about 7% less pork available in the United States, that has allowed retail prices to go through the stratosphere so that now pork producers can pay $6 to $7 for corn. The right-hand side is saying production is actually up in the United States on total pork production. You say, wait a minute, if we're producing less for U.S. consumers, how could we be up on total production? And the answer is, we have other consumers other than our U.S. consumers. This is the foreign export market. We look at the foreign export market. There is a purplish line I'll point over here. That's pork. If we go back to that big arrow, is 6 to 7. This is the 2006, 6 and 7. And you can see we're exporting about 15% of our pork. That pinkish purple line, now we're 22%. So what we see in the last 5 years is that while U.S. consumers have not been able to pay these high prices, or we lost some consumers as prices went up, foreign consumers are there and buying more and more. So this is a tremendous opportunity we face at this time. The black line is the amount of increase in U.S. exports of pork. That's 60+% since 2006, 2007. Wow, is this big opportunity. The blue line is total production of pork in the United States for the last decade or so. You can see basically pretty flat, down a little bit in recent years over on the right-hand side. But the red line, the blue line is total consumption of pork. The red line at the top is total production. Overall, total production still going up when U.S. consumption is basically flat or down a little bit. What's the difference? Stuff down at the bottom, export markets. Let me skip over that one and look at the retail sector here just a bit. These are retail prices, cents per pound for pork. Left-hand side, 2,258. And we can see kind of an inflationary increase, about 1.5%, 2% a year, extending through 2009. We got up to $2.92 a pound. So that's when we finally started really cutting back pork supplies, and off takes the price at the retail level. So the last 2 years, we've been up about 9% a year on retail pork prices. We got beef up there about 7% a year. So we're seeing massive increases at the retail level, and that's where we're seeing the cutting back in consumption base. Let me just skip over a few of these and get to this sort of bottom line point. What I see for the animal industry, and certainly the swine industry, is $7 corn now is kind of a fulcrum. If we can keep corn under $7 a bushel, our industry, the pork industry, is going to be just fine. I think the poultry industry, the dairy industry, the beef industry will be just fine if we can keep corn under $7 a bushel. In fact, if we had to go higher, let's do that one first, go over to $8 corn here on the teeter-totter. If we push back up towards $8 corn, then our industries, our animal industries, have to reduce somewhat. They have to go down. They have to go through another period of loss, cut back. On the other hand, if we get corn under $6 a bushel, we're going to see expansion in our industries. We're going to be making money. Basically, hog industry, I got $7 corn we can pay this year, 2012, and pay all the bills, break even. We're probably going to be under $7 for all of this year, and we're even looking at cheaper prices for the 2012 crop. This is a lot of promise. If we can get below $6 on corn, we're actually going to start to see some expansion coming in the pork industry. We're trying to hold them off until we see if this summer's crop comes along okay. Now, what does this mean in terms of cost of production, this feed cost, and the price of hogs? The line, the pinkish line there, is the estimate of cost of production on a live weight basis on hogs. Back in 6, early 7, $2 corn, we could raise hogs for 30, 35, 37, 38, low 40s. If hog prices were in the 40s or maybe low 50s, good profitability. You can see over on the right-hand side, especially 2011, early 12, more like cost of production on up in the 60 or low 60s. And therefore, if you're going to make money in hogs, you've got to be in the 60s or 70s. Now, we could relate this the same way over to a consumer price. You just got to have pork up there at a lot higher price to pay these prices for the feed. So what we have then, the bars are the estimates of price of hogs or historic price of hogs. Above cost, we return to profitability in the hog business the second quarter of 2011. So we're approaching now a full year of profitability, and we've got profits projected going on out as far as we're running now through the middle of 2013. If we bring corn prices down somewhat more, which is our anticipation, we're going to even see more profitability, and we're going to start to see some expansion finally in our industry. Here's the outlook on corn. If you look at the Chicago Board of Trade futures prices and try to equate those, these are kind of a Illinois, Indiana, central Midwest price. Those are months at the bottom: March, April, May, June, July, August. And what we see is a little bit more of this old crop, a few more months getting into this summer of those $6.50 corn prices, and then moderation coming in, if we can get a normal crop this year. And the pattern that takes us through the 13 crop and into the 14 crop, and the overall slope is to the downside. Now, that's the futures market. A lot can affect that. A lot can change. But what we're really seeing is we're at a fundamental turning point in these grain markets, going from higher and higher overall prices to one where we now think, at least my evaluation is, those demand growth factors are going to slow. We already see supply coming back. We see world supply really picking up. We've had 2 bad years in a row on corn yields. We get back to a lot of acres this year with normal yields, and we start to rebuild inventories of corn, soybeans, and wheat, and that moderates prices. It's not a plunging of prices of grains and feed ingredient inputs, but it's moderation. Now, will that happen? Stay tuned. Let me come back next year, and I can say, well, I was wrong last year, but if you keep inviting me, I'll get it right one of these years. It's like the weather forecasters. If you're forecasting drought, they say what? Never quit, because eventually, if you'll just keep forecasting it, it will happen eventually. And there is the drought map. So this is well worth watching. And, of course, we're most concerned about that area of northwest Iowa. I've visited with several of you about that area. Not that it's so dry, but there's just not a lot of subsoil at this point. So that's a scary map for corn and soybeans when you've got portions of Iowa, all of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas already getting very, very dry. Now, the good thing to say is, hey, if you have to have a drought in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, it's a great time to have a drought in the winter. If you got to have a drought, choose the winter time. So there's still time to recover and have a very normal crop, but we're all going to watch this extremely closely, that upper western Corn Belt area. That's the forecast, the National Weather Service. Through May of this year, the brown is keeping Iowa and Minnesota in drouthy conditions, and then the Dakotas would start to really move into drought as well. So we'll just have to watch this. It is a little ominous at this point. It is a threat to a normal crop, but the one thing we're probably going to get is an early start to this growing season and planting season, and I think that overall we saw that in Wednesday's market on corn, pretty sharply down. Early start, early planting. Markets generally think that's going to help give us good yields. Okay, just a little bit about China. And China's pork trade, the imports are what we're interested in. That's the blue line. Now, this goes back to 1990. And what I want you to look at is that period about 2003, 4, 5, where China was exporting more pork than they were importing. But something begins to look perhaps very different starting with 08, 07 and 08, I guess, and that is that blue line. They seem to be saying, we need pork, we'll buy that pork that we're short, and that's a different strategy than what we've seen in the past. Primarily not buying imports or even exporting more than the importing, but now we begin to see some potential changes. This is the blue line on top. That's per capita pork consumption in China. And the red line is per capita pork consumption in the United States. And I keep talking to the USDA, you're wrong. That can't be right. They eat more pork in China per person than we do in the United States. But they don't eat much else in terms of other meats. So just a little bit of beef, chicken is coming into that market now. And then as we look at the opportunity, so I see the opportunity for our industries of all the difficulty we've been through with the high feed prices. We've adjusted to that. We have our consumer still with us. I think we'll be able to get that some of that consumption base back here in the United States, but here's the growth opportunity. Let's go down to the U.S. at the bottom. The annual growth opportunity in pork consumption increase. Pork consumption is based, we'd be talking about population. Do you have more mouths to feed? And the per capita supply. This last 10 years, basically the U.S., the consumption base is flat. We are not, there's no growth in this market in the United States in terms of a place. If you want to grow your pork industry, the U.S. is a big market, and that's our primary market, but it's not a growth market. Let's start with our neighbor to the south, where we're really doing well on pork exports. Not only as incomes grow, they want more meat, but they have still a pretty high population growth rate per year, and their per capita consumptions on pork are increasing. That's a market that's giving us about a 4% a year growth opportunity. There's China, number 2, at 3% a year. And that's a lot of people. So those are markets we want to look at. And even South Korea, 2.5%. So our growth opportunity isn't really in the U.S. It's not really in Japan. It's in these other countries, and that is what we're going to head for. So I'm pretty optimistic. I'm hoping we're going to get some moderation in feed prices. If we get some moderation, we'll get a little bit less volatility. That would be nice. We get a little less moderation in feed prices. We're going to get some expansion coming in 2013, and the real growth opportunities are out there. First time ever we've heard this term, China's going to eat your lunch. We're seeing some of that in the sense that these world markets are willing to pay for food. Our U.S. consumers are struggling to pay for that food, but we've got great market and great market opportunity overseas.